When Britain began taxing its American colonies, some saw it as an abuse of their powers. The violence that ensued led to the creation of a new nation that looked to preserve its independence from what it perceived as an overzealous parliament and a tyrannical king. But the fight for independence would not be an easy one, as it required an intercontinental war against a global superpower in order to achieve life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Part 1. The Folly of England and the Ruin of America. In 1763, after the Treaty of Paris was signed, peace returned to North America and Europe. The French and Indian War in North America and the 7 Years' War in Europe had ended. Great Britain came out on top as a leading global power. In North America, Britain took control of all of France's land west of the Mississippi River. They also got Florida from Spain. In return, France gave Spain its remaining territories east of the Mississippi, including New Orleans. After the war, King George III and the British Prime Minister, the Earl of Bute, chose to keep the army stationed in North America. The army had grown during the war and was filled with officers who held political influence. The king saw this army as key to his control, and wanted the American colonies to help pay for it. In 1763, George Grenville took over as Prime Minister. He did not question the decision to keep troops in America. Grenville was a sharp politician, but he faced some difficult challenges. The American frontier was still unstable, as settlers kept moving into indigenous lands, despite British efforts to stop them. Virginia was especially aggressive in grabbing land, as they had already invested in the Ohio River Valley, the land that sparked the French and Indian War in the first place. Native people living west of the Appalachian Mountains were upset when General Jeffrey Amherst, the commander of British forces in America, stopped the French tradition of giving them gifts like blankets, clothes, and tools. He also failed to stop white settlers from moving onto the lands and prevent traders from cheating them. By May 1763, many Native Americans, led by Chief Pontiac of the Ottawa tribe, had had enough. They rebelled, attacking settlements in Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania, and even took over several British forts. When the British government heard about the rebellion, they responded by issuing the Royal Proclamation of 1763 in October. This law reserved all the land west of the Appalachian Mountains for Native Americans. Many colonists, especially those who had wanted land in the Ohio Valley, were furious. They felt that the proclamation invalidated the whole point of the recent war. Despite the proclamation, fighting continued in the Northwest, and settlers kept moving west. By 1765, hundreds of settlers, farmers, fur traders, and land speculators had ignored the proclamation and moved into the frontier anyway. At the center of Grenville's issues was money. After the war, Britain had a huge debt to pay, over 140 million pounds sterling by 1765, and it kept growing. Paying off this debt would be tough, as raising taxes in Britain was not popular. For example, the Sutter tax in 1763 led to riots and protests in England, which even caused Bute to step down as Prime Minister. People were already taxed on land, beer, tobacco, sugar, and other items. But the government still needed money, especially to pay for the troops stationed in America. To get more money for the army and to help reduce the debt, Grenville's government decided to tax the American colonies, who it believed would be willing to pay up. One idea was to lower the old tax on imported molasses as imposed by the Molasses Act of 1733, hoping that a lower rate would make the colonists actually pay for it. Smuggling in regards to the Molasses Act had been a big problem. American merchants often avoided paying the tax, sometimes bribing customs officers. The Molasses Act banned the import of molasses and sugar to the colonies unless it came from Britain. The colonists needed molasses to make rum, but the British West Indies could not supply enough, so they turned to buying and smuggling from other countries. After the war, Granville wanted to change the Molasses Act. First, he made sure his customs collectors actually went to work in the colonies instead of staying in England and getting paid for doing nothing by their officers in America. Many collectors quit rather than make the move across the ocean. Once new collectors were in place, Granville pushed the Sugar Act through Parliament in 1764, aiming to get more money from the colonies. The Sugar Act wasn't just about lowering the tax on foreign molasses. It also raised the tax on foreign sugar and created new trade rules. For example, certain goods like lumber could only be shipped to Britain. The real problem was how the act was enforced. Merchants and ship captains had to follow strict rules for unloading and unloading cargo. If they did not, they could face trial in courts without juries, or judges picked by the king decided their fate. These courts often treated the accused as guilty until proven innocent, which felt unfair to many American colonists. Some merchants expected to bribe their way around the new law, as they had in the past. But the Sugar Act also brought back the old Navigation Acts, which aimed to put colonial trade completely under British control. British officers now enforced these rules more strictly. Navy ships patrolled the waters, making it harder for merchants to smuggle goods. Still, some smugglers managed to unload their goods, often under the cover of night. The bigger issue was that the act clearly aimed to make money for the British government. Many colonists worried that the Sugar Act would hurt their businesses. People like Samuel Adams of Boston protested, arguing that they were being unfairly taxed because they did not have any say in the British Parliament. If taxes are laid upon us in any shape without ever having a legal representative where they are laid, Adams argued, are we not reduced from the character of free subjects to the miserable state of tributary slaves? A new, much more egregious act was introduced in 1765, the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act required all legal papers, newspapers, and even playing cards to have an official stamp. These stamps cost anywhere from half a penny for a newspaper to £6 for larger documents. If you did not have a stamp, your document was considered void. The British saw this as a fair way to raise money, but the American colonists were outraged. Many other colonial governments were outraged too. Colonies like Virginia, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and 6 others sent colonial representatives in October to meet in New York. They expressed loyalty to the British Crown, but argued that only their local legislatures had the right to tax them, not Parliament. The Stamp Act Congress also pointed out that the taxes were so high that they could not afford to buy British goods, which would hurt both the colonies and England. They sent messages to the King, the House of Lords, and the House of Commons, expressing their dissatisfaction. Across the colonies, anger and resistance grew. Groups called the Sons of Liberty formed, particularly in the northern colonies, to fight back against the Stamp Act. In Boston, they hanged an effigy of the local stamp officer, Andrew Oliver, and attacked his house. They also destroyed records, sacked the customs office, and even ransacked the home of the lieutenant governor and Oliver's brother-in-law, Thomas Hutchinson. Most stamp officers grew too scared to enforce the law, and when new stamps arrived, few were willing to distribute them. Some were destroyed or locked away, promises that they would not be sold. After the act came into effect on November 1st, people found ways to work around the law. Unstamped newspapers were printed, and after a brief pause, business resumed. The Stamp Act was simply ignored. However, the law was still technically in place. To force its repeal, the colonies boycotted British goods. The boycott hurt Britain's economy. Factories in England shut down. Thousands of people lost jobs, and merchants faced bankruptcy. By December, Parliament had to reconsider. The protests from England's business community could not be ignored. William Pitt, a popular figure of the 7 Years' War in England, and many other Whig politicians argued that Parliament had no right to impose the Stamp Act, and after heated debates, the act was repealed in March 1766. The news of the repeal brought celebration across the colonies. People held parties, lit fireworks, and expressed gratitude to Britain. Statues of the king were put up, and the leaders of the repeal effort were honored. The Sons of Liberty ceased their activity. For a moment, tensions eased, but in reality, it was only a temporary pause in the growing divide between Britain and its colonies. Part 2. Death and Taxes. In July 1766, William Pitt became the British Prime Minister, though he was growing old and sick. He took the job but quit in 1768 to join the House of Lords. The Duke of Grafton replaced him as Prime Minister, but he did not have much power. The real leader was Charles Townshend, who did not like America. Pitt's illness gave Townshend the chance to shine. Townshend was confident and bold, but impulsive. In 1767, he said he could get money from America without angering them. He thought Americans did not mind external taxes on things brought into the country, like the Molasses and Sugar Acts, but hated direct internal taxes like the Stamp Act. So, he added taxes on glass, paint, and tea brought from Britain to America. This money would pay colonial governors and judges, so they would not have to depend on local governments. But Townshend got it wrong. The Americans had just beaten the Stamp Act and felt ready to resist again. When these new taxes were added, Americans stopped caring about whether taxes were external or internal. They had grown to hate all taxes. The Townshend Acts ended the brief peace between the colonies and Britain. Massachusetts led the fight by sending the circular letter, written by Samuel Adams, to other colonies, urging them to join in the resistance. The British government told the colonial governors to make their legislatures cancel any opposition or dissolve them, which only made people angrier. The Americans fought back by restarting their boycott of British goods, once again led by the Sons of Liberty. In June 1768, when British officials seized the wealthy John Hancock's ship, the Liberty, for smuggling, a mob attacked them. The customs officials had to escape to Castle Williams in Boston Harbor. In response, General Thomas Gage was told to send 2 regiments to Boston to keep order. When the soldiers arrived in October 1768, Bostonians refused to house and supply them for free, as required by law as per the Quartering Act of 1765. The soldiers instead had to rent rooms across the city, causing problems. Bostonians saw them as foreign invaders and treated them poorly, and the soldiers responded with rudeness. This led to occasional street fights between the townspeople and soldiers. On March 5, 1770, tensions in Boston boiled over. Outside the customs house, a British guard stood watch when an apprentice insulted him. The guard hit the boy with his musket. A crowd gathered, throwing snowballs and ice at the guard. The guard fixed his bayonet, loaded his musket, and tapped on the ground, while the crowd taunted him to shoot. A group of soldiers soon arrived. They also loaded their guns, but were told not to fire. The crowd kept pushing, daring the soldiers to shoot. "You can't kill us all." Suddenly, a soldier was knocked down by a piece of wood. He got up and fired his musket, and the other soldiers followed. When it was over, 3 men were dead, and several others were wounded. The next day, Boston's shops shut down, and church bells rang. Thousands of people lined the streets for the funerals. When news of the Boston Massacre spread, militias gathered, and war seemed to be on the brink. But Governor Hutchinson calmed things down, convincing the British commander, Colonel William Dalrymple, to move the troops to Castle William in the harbor. After the massacre, things calmed down. Over time, people got tired of boycotting British goods and quietly started buying them again. Some folks blamed others for breaking the boycott, which caused arguments between the colonies. It took another big event to reignite the resistance, and it happened in June 1772. A British ship, the Gaspé, got stuck while chasing a suspected smuggler near Rhode Island. Hearing this, 8 boats filled with volunteers from nearby Providence went out, captured the ship, and set it on fire. During the attack, the British commander was hurt. Many Americans saw this as a stand against British control, but England was outraged. Though the locals knew who did it, British investigators could not pin it on anyone. To avoid stirring up more trouble, British officials decided to drop the matter. Much like New England, the South also clashed with British rule. In North Carolina, corrupt officials and greedy landowners made life hard for poor farmers in the frontier. Many fell into debt, lost their land, and faced heavy taxes, while the rich colonial elites paid little. To make matters worse, debts and taxes had to be paid in hard cash, which was hard to come by, and the courts, run by the elites, offered no help. By 1768, groups called Regulators began to form across western North Carolina, demanding justice and fair treatment. They tried legal methods such as petitions, but, when ignored, they stopped paying taxes, reclaimed seized property, and disrupted court sessions. Governor William Tryon tried to use a militia to dissuade the Regulators, but failed when the militiamen refused to fight. In 1770, frustrated Regulators attacked officials in Hillsborough, leading the government to pass Johnson's Riot Act. This allowed Tryon to bring in the military. In May 1771, he confronted the Regulators at Alamance Creek with 1,100 men. Though they outnumbered the Redcoats, the Regulators were defeated after a few hours of battle. Several were killed or captured, and one Regulator was executed afterwards without trial. King George later pardoned all Regulators except Herman Husband, a prominent leader of the Regulators who had fled and settled in Pennsylvania. The harsh treatment of the Regulators turned many people in the North Carolinian back country against the colonial elites. In South Carolina, the Regulator movement also existed, but it took a different form. Unlike in North Carolina, where the Regulators were made up of farmers and frontiersmen, South Carolina's Regulators were made up of middle-class planters, shopkeepers, and landowners who acted as vigilantes to stop crime on the frontier, as the government failed to provide law enforcement. By 1771, courts were set up, and the South Carolina Regulators were pardoned. Alongside the Gaspé Affair, it took another monumental event to unite the colonies in their resistance. This event took the form of the near failure of the East India Company. Since Americans were boycotting British goods, the company was losing money because no one was buying its tea. The company was stuck with 70 million pounds of tea in its warehouses and nowhere to send them, and was thus close to going broke. Since many government officials had ties to the company, they came up with a solution. They passed the Tea Act, which let the company avoid paying import taxes in England and sell the excess tea directly to America, cutting out the middlemen. Even with the tax, this tea would be cheaper than smuggled tea. However, the colonists did not care about the lower price. They saw this as yet another attempt to tax them without their approval. This again stirred up anger across the colonies, from Maine to Georgia. In Charleston, the tea was seized and left to rot. In Philadelphia and New York, the tea ships were forced to return to England. But Boston made the biggest statement with the Boston Tea Party. On December 16, 1773, members of the Sons of Liberty, dressed as Mohawk natives, boarded British ships and dumped over 300 chests of tea, worth about 15,000 pounds sterling, into the harbor. King George was furious, especially with Boston. In response, the British government passed strict laws called the Intolerable Acts to punish the city. The first act shut down Boston's port, allowing only the nearby towns of Salem and Marblehead to operate. The second act took away parts of Massachusetts' charter, giving almost all the power held by the colonial government and the courts over to the king and the governor. The third act allowed people accused of serious crimes during the protest to be sent to England for trial. The fourth act let British soldiers be housed in people's homes. To make sure these laws were enforced, General Gage was made the new governor of Massachusetts. Part 3. A State of Rebellion. By the mid-1700s, Boston was a city of 20,000 souls. It was a busy port known for building ships, fishing for cod, whaling, and trading. Boston also made a lot of rum, relying on molasses from the West Indies. But when the Intolerable Acts were passed, and the city's harbor was closed, Boston turned into a ghost town. Most of Gage's efforts to govern were met with a boycott. His appointed council members refused to serve, and when a Supreme Court was called, no one showed up for jury duty. Gage also could not find locals willing to house his growing number of troops. Boston had suggested forming a Congress for the colony's next course of action, which led to the First Continental Congress meeting in Philadelphia. 12 colonies sent representatives. While they did not call for independence, they sent a Declaration of Rights, listing their complaints and agreeing to stop buying British goods. In the meantime, colonists around Boston smuggled weapons out of the city. Massachusetts formed its own government, the Provincial Congress, and began stockpiling military supplies. They created special Minutemen regiments, who were to be armed and ready for battle at a moment's notice. The militia spent their winter preparing for war by raiding British stockpiles and training. Meanwhile, back in Britain, King George was not upset by the resistance. In fact, he even seemed eager to go to war. "The line of conduct seems now chalked out," wrote King George. "The New England governments are in a state of rebellion. Blows must decide whether they are subject to this country or independent." After General Gage arrived in Massachusetts, the British Army stayed mostly inactive, but tensions with the colonists grew. Gage knew the Americans had weapons stored in nearby Concord and kept an eye on things. By March 1775, even small British movements caused alarm among the colonists, who were watching closely, especially through the skilled severalist Paul Revere and his group. In mid-April, Revere and his network noticed signs of a British expedition. He went to warn John Hancock and Samuel Adams in Lexington. Gage's secret plan to take the weapons in Concord leaked, and Revere and his friend William Dawes rode out to alarm the countryside. Dr. Samuel Prescott joined them and continued the alarm after Revere was caught. At dawn, British troops arrived in Lexington, where 70 Minutemen stood waiting. After a tense standoff, a shot was fired from an unknown soldier. The British then opened fire, killing 8 Americans, and then marched on to Concord, unaware that militia forces from all across eastern Massachusetts were gathering nearby. In Concord, the British found few weapons, but the local militia thought the British were burning the town. The Americans moved in, and though the British fired first, the militia fought back, killing several British soldiers. The British retreat turned into chaos, and were ambushed constantly on their way back to Boston. By the time they reached Charlestown, the British had 273 casualties, while the Americans lost 95. The American Revolution had begun. As news of the events at Lexington and Concord spread all the way south to Charleston, South Carolina, militias quickly mobilized across the colonies, though they were mostly untrained and lacked crucial supplies. On April 23rd, the Provincial Congress voted to raise an army of 30,000, but by June, only 15,000 under General Artemas Ward were ready to fight. These forces formed a blockade around Boston, cutting off the British trapped within. Both sides were stuck in a stalemate with food shortages. In late May, the British frigate Cerberus arrived in Boston with Major Generals William Howe, Henry Clinton, and John Burgoyne. Gage and Burgoyne offered a pardon to any Americans who surrendered, except for Samuel Adams and John Hancock. This only further angered the colonists, strengthening their resolve. The New Englanders grew worried about a potential British attack from Quebec, led by Guy Carleton. To prevent this, members of the Provincial Congress supported capturing Fort Ticonderoga in New York, which Carleton might use. Ethan Allen, leader of the Green Mountain Boys, and Benedict Arnold, a skilled soldier, both wanted to secure the fort's cannons and supplies. On May 10th, about 200 men, led by Allen and Arnold, surprised the fort's weak defenses and easily took control, securing important weapons for the ongoing siege of Boston. Meanwhile, in Boston, General Artemas Ward made a mistake by focusing on Charlestown instead of the more strategic Dorchester Heights. On June 16th, American soldiers began building fortifications on Breed's Hill. Under pressure from his fellow generals, Gage ordered an attack. Despite limited supplies and leadership, the Americans held their ground, firing deadly volleys at the British as they advanced. After 2 failed British assaults, the Americans, low on ammo, were forced to retreat. Though the British captured Charlestown, they suffered heavy losses with over 1,000 dead or wounded, compared to around 500 Americans. At the same time in Philadelphia, the Second Continental Congress was talking about the future of the American Army. John Adams, the cousin of Samuel Adams, suggested forming a national army under George Washington, a veteran of the French and Indian War. By July 2nd, Washington arrived in Massachusetts to lead the newly named Continental Army. 4 major generals, Charles Lee, Artemas Ward, Philip Schuyler, and Israel Putnam, were also chosen to help him. In New York, Henry Knox, a former bookseller, took on the task of moving the cannons of Fort Ticonderoga to Boston. Knox and his men managed to haul 59 cannons over 300 miles of rough terrain and harsh winter weather. On March 4th, 1776. These cannons were set up on Dorchester Heights, forcing the British and any loyalists to leave Boston by the 17th. Washington, instead of celebrating, began preparing for the next British attack, concluding that New York City would be their new target. It is the object worthy of their attention, and it is the place that we must use every endeavor to keep from them. Part 4. The Cause of All Mankind. While the Americans focused on Boston, the Continental Congress decided to invade Canada. They wanted to protect their northern border and hoped Canada would join them. The Americans thought that the French Catholics in Canada were under threat from the British. The fate of the Catholic and Protestant colonies is strongly linked together, wrote the Second Continental Congress. The enjoyment of your very religion depends on a legislature in which you have no share and over which you have no control. General Philip Schuyler was supposed to lead the invasion, but he got sick, so General Richard Montgomery took over. Even though the soldiers were poorly equipped and faced tough conditions, they marched towards the British fort at St. John's. After 2 hard months, the fort finally fell in November 1775. Montgomery then took nearby Montreal, but Governor Guy Carleton escaped to Quebec. At the same time, Benedict Arnold led another army through the rough and tortuous Maine wilderness to meet Montgomery and attack Quebec. Both groups faced extreme hardships, but joined forces for a final attack on December 31st. The attack began in a blinding snowstorm and went terribly wrong. Montgomery was killed, Arnold was wounded, and hundreds of Americans were captured. The attempt to take Canada failed, and the American army, now weakened by smallpox, had to retreat. When spring came, the British received reinforcements, including thousands of German mercenaries, and fought back. Arnold tried to defend Lake Champlain in a naval battle, but lost, leaving the region under British control. As the Americans returned after the failed invasion of Canada, the British turned their attention to the southern colonies. Admiral Peter Parker led a fleet of 10 warships, carrying 2,500 troops under Henry Clinton. After hearing about a loss at Moore's Creek in North Carolina, Parker and Clinton decided to attack Charleston instead. On June 28, 1776, the British bombarded Sullivan's Island in the harbor, but the fort's defenses, made of palmetto logs and sandy walls, absorbed the hits. The Americans then fired back, badly damaging Parker's flagship, but forced him to retreat. While Boston was under siege and the war unfolded in Canada, the Continental Congress met in Philadelphia to discuss the future of the colonies, now increasingly referred to as states. The idea of independence was gaining traction, though some feared breaking away from Britain would bring disaster. John Adams pushed hard for unity and a new form of government made up of independent states. Thomas Paine's popular pamphlet, Common Sense, endorsed by Benjamin Franklin, laid out these ideas in plain language. Paine argued that America is only a secondary object in the system of British politics. England consults the good of this country no further than it answers for her own purpose. He claimed that America's fight for freedom was, in large measure, the cause of all mankind. As the debate over independence continued, Congress formed a committee, including Benjamin Franklin, Adams, and Thomas Jefferson, to draft a formal declaration. Jefferson took the task of writing it. On July 1, 1776, Congress began debating independence. After some hesitation, the resolution passed on July 2nd. officially declaring the colonies as free and independent states. The final version of the Declaration of Independence was presented on July 4th. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, a decent respect for the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to this separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. With General Howe's evacuation of Boston and Admiral Parker's defeat in Charleston, the British had no strong base in America. New York became the next big target, because its harbor could control access to the Hudson River, which led to Canada through Lake Champlain. Washington recognized New York's importance, so he quickly moved his troops there from Boston. As American soldiers arrived in New York, helped by those from Maryland and Delaware, they started building defenses. Meanwhile, General Howe gathered a huge fleet and army, planning to land on Long Island. Washington made a mistake by splitting his troops between Manhattan and Long Island, leaving them open to attack. On August 22nd, the British landed on Long Island without resistance. Howe's forces flanked and beat the American defenses in the battle that followed. The Americans lost thousands of soldiers, but Washington was able to lead a quiet retreat to Manhattan under the cover of night. Howe could have crushed the American forces, but held back, hampered by poor winds, which gave Washington time to regroup. After the British took Kips Bay in Manhattan, Washington set up defenses at Harlem Heights. There, the Americans won a small battle that boosted morale. Even though Howe still controlled New York, Washington prepared for more fighting. On November 16th, the British and their Hessian allies captured Fort Washington in Manhattan. A few days later, they took Fort Lee in New Jersey. Washington's forces were shrinking. Many soldiers were captured at Fort Washington, and many more did not have proper clothing or supplies. He led a retreat through New Jersey, with the British chasing them. Even with all these problems, Washington managed to gather nearly 6,000 soldiers, though many lacked gear. On the night of December 25th, Washington led his men across the icy Delaware River and surprised the Hessians at Trenton, winning a quick yet decisive victory. The British General Charles Cornwallis threatened to push the Americans back into the river, but Washington cleverly moved his troops around the British rear guard and won another battle at Princeton in the new year. The victories at Trenton and Princeton were monumental. They weakened British control in New Jersey and helped recruit more American soldiers, just in time as many original veterans were finishing their enlistment contracts. With the Redcoats routed and Washington's army tired, he set up winter quarters in nearby Morristown. Though the army was small, it stayed together, ready to keep fighting for America's independence. Part 5. The Turning Point. In the spring of 1777, General Howe planned to divide the American colonies. General Burgoyne would march from Canada and meet Howe in New York along the Hudson River. But Howe believed Burgoyne could handle it alone. So, instead, he took his troops south to Chesapeake Bay, aiming to capture Philadelphia. The sea journey took too long, giving Washington time to prepare and block his path. On September 11th, the two armies fought at Brandywine Creek. Howe outflanked the Americans and won, but Washington's army wasn't destroyed. Howe then attacked an American garrison at Paoli, killing hundreds, and sent Cornwallis to capture Philadelphia. However, Washington's forces were still nearby. Howe needed one more victory before fully securing the city. The next big battle happened in Germantown, a British-controlled village near Philadelphia. Washington was the one to begin the attack, but a thick autumn fog made things chaotic. Despite vigorous fighting resulting in the capture of some British positions, confusion led to American soldiers accidentally firing on each other. A British counterattack forced the Americans, low on ammunition, to retreat, losing nearly 1,000 men. For winter, Washington's 11,000 troops quartered in the remote Valley Forge. They marched through snow, rain, and mud to get there. You might have tracked the army from White Marsh to Valley Forge by the blood at their feet, wrote Washington. They were in the roughest shape yet. Worn-out clothes, little food, and cold weather were the bane of their existence. The Thanksgiving of 1777 passed with almost no food to celebrate. Disease made things worse, and many soldiers fell ill. Despite these hardships, the army held together. European observers were impressed by how they survived. In February, a Prussian military officer named Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben arrived to train them. Though he barely spoke English, he connected with the troops and started teaching them proper military drills. Slowly but surely, he turned the disorganized army into a well-trained fighting force. Thanks to von Steuben, the American army left Valley Forge stronger than ever and more prepared to continue the fight for America's independence. In May 1778, General Howe was replaced by Henry Clinton. Clinton needed to send troops to the West Indies and withdraw to New York due to some recent developments in Europe. Washington saw this as a chance to test his newly trained army. As Clinton's forces marched through New Jersey, Washington followed them. At the Battle of Monmouth in June, the American General Charles Lee retreated for unclear reasons. Washington quickly took command, fired Lee on the spot, and stopped the British counterattack. While the battle wasn't a clear victory, Washington's army held firm, forcing the British to pull back. By July, the British were back in New York, while Washington's army watched them closely from White Plains. Meanwhile, Burgoyne was struggling in New York. His campaign was doomed from the start. Howe, who was supposed to help, had left for Philadelphia. Another officer, Barrymore St. Leger, was meant to block any rebels heading north, but that plan also fell apart. His mostly Native American troops fled when they heard rumors, spread by Benedict Arnold, that a large American army was coming. St. Leger's remaining forces retreated. At first, Burgoyne had some success. He captured Fort Ticonderoga on July 6, 1777, without a fight. But instead of traveling the Hudson down to New York, he chose to march through the thick forest. This difficult path drained his resources, so he sent a large group of his men to Bennington, Vermont for supplies. John Stark's militia defeated them when they arrived in August. With no easy way to retreat, Burgoyne crossed the Hudson River and tried to challenge the American army in Albany, led by General Horatio Gates. The Americans had built strong defenses. On September 19th, Burgoyne tried to break through at Freeman's Farm, but was stopped, mostly by sharpshooters. He tried again on October 7th, but that also miserably failed. He lost 1,200 men in these battles and pulled back to Saratoga. Surrounded by American forces that outnumbered him 3-1, Burgoyne had no way out. After 4 days, he had no choice but to surrender on October 14th. General Gates allowed him to negotiate most of the surrender terms. As mentioned before, some European countries watched the American Revolution without getting involved. But after battles like Germantown and Monmouth, and the defeat of General Burgoyne's army, some decided to step in. The colonies were already looking for outside help since they did not have enough money, supplies, or ships to fight Britain alone. They turned to France for support, especially because France's foreign minister, the Comte de Vergennes, wanted to weaken Britain. France, impressed by the Americans after Saratoga, officially recognized the United States as a separate country. 3 American representatives, Benjamin Franklin, Silas Deane, and Arthur Lee, went to Paris, and on February 6, 1778, they signed the Treaty of Alliance, promising French military and financial help until the U.S. gained independence. France also agreed not to make peace with Britain until America was free. The American War had become a European war. The alliance soon began bearing fruit. In July, a French fleet arrived on the east coast. The French Admiral d'Estaing and General Washington planned to attack the British in Newport, Rhode Island, but a hurricane scattered both the French and the encroaching British ships. The French had to go to Boston for repairs, and d'Estaing later left for the West Indies to fight the British there. The war also reached Europe. In 1779, Spain joined forces with the French and tried to take back the strategically important Gibraltar Peninsula, which they had lost to Britain over 60 years earlier. Though the British garrison at Gibraltar was small and struggling, they held out. Despite being blockaded, British reinforcements managed to occasionally sneak past the Spanish and French fleets. What Spain hoped would be a quick victory turned into a long, 3-year slog. In early 1783, Spain and France were forced to accept a colossal and humiliating defeat. Also, in regards to the war in Europe, it is important to note that Britain had to keep tens of thousands of troops at home to defend against a possible French invasion, leaving fewer soldiers available to fight overseas. Back in America, Benedict Arnold, the once heroic American general, started plotting with the British. Upset that Congress questions his usage of public funds, Arnold secretly contacted British Major John Andre and offered to give up West Point in New York for money and a British military rank. The plan fell apart when Andre was captured with paper evidence of the betrayal. Arnold fled to a British ship, and Andre was hanged as a spy. Arnold's betrayal shocked the Americans, but at least the threat to New York was stopped. Meanwhile, the American Revolution wasn't just fought on the East Coast. It also was waged on the frontiers of North America and the ocean. As mentioned towards the beginning of this video, the countless indigenous tribes west of the Appalachian Mountains had watched hundreds of American settlers move into their lands and wanted to stop them, a tension that only grew by 1778. British Lieutenant Colonel Henry Hamilton, stationed in Detroit, actively encouraged native raids on settlers. In response, George Rogers Clark led a group of Virginian militiamen into the British-controlled Illinois country starting in 1778. Clark captured Hamilton by 1779, giving the U.S. control of the Midwest. Meanwhile, in New York's Mohawk Valley, Loyalists and Iroquois allied with the British and attacked the American frontier towns. In 1779, George Washington sent General John Sullivan to destroy their villages and crops, which forever broke the power of the once mighty Iroquois Confederacy. At sea, the American colonies had many experienced sailors, but not enough resources to build a strong navy. They relied mostly on privateers, private sailors who worked for better pay compared to state navies. They were very effective at damaging British trade. Still, some clung to the idea of a state-built navy, until the disastrous, wasteful, An extremely expensive Penobscot expedition off the coast of Maine in 1779 convinced many that a national navy simply wasn't worth the expense. Privateers continued to excel on the seas, especially when John Paul Jones became a hero when he defeated the British ship Serapis off the coast of England in 1779. Part 6. The War for the South. In late 1778, the British shifted their focus to the southern colonies. They sent ships full of soldiers, including Hessians and Loyalists, to southern Carolina and Georgia. By early 1779, the British had control of Savannah, Sunbury, and Augusta, securing Georgia. The British began fortifying the area while the Americans struggled to find the men to beat them back. Then, Admiral d'Estaing promised reinforcements from the West Indies. By September, thousands of French soldiers arrived, but instead of attacking quickly, d'Estaing delayed, giving the British time to build stronger defenses. On October 9, 1779, the French and American forces under General Benjamin Lincoln attacked Savannah. However, the plan was poorly executed, and they suffered many losses. The British still held Savannah, and Admiral d'Estaing left for the West Indies again, and General Lincoln, worn out and defeated, withdrew to Charleston. In early 1780, Henry Clinton saw a chance to push further south. He arrived near Charleston with 10,000 troops. General Lincoln made the mistake of staying in the city, as he saw it necessary to defend Charleston. In May, Lincoln was forced to surrender the city with 5,500 men. After taking Charleston, Clinton went back to New York, leaving Cornwallis in charge. Cornwallis then began trying to take control of the Carolinas. At the same time, an American militia led by Horatio Gates marched south to challenge the British. His troops were poorly supplied, and his overconfidence led to a terrible loss at Camden in August. Many of his men fled the battlefield in droves. After the Americans lost at Camden, small groups of rebels, like Swamp Fox Francis Marion's militia, kept up the fight. Marion led constant surprise attacks on British troops in the countryside. In October, Cornwallis sent Major Patrick Ferguson and 1,000 Loyalists to the mountains of North Carolina to strengthen British control. Ferguson warned the locals to support the British or suffer, but the settlers, known as the Over-Mountain Men, refused. They formed militias under Isaac Shelby and John Sevier, and met Ferguson's forces at Kings Mountain. Using the landscape to their advantage, they overwhelmed Ferguson's men, killing him and wiping out most of his troops. Cornwallis had to abandon plans to control North Carolina. By December, Congress replaced the unpopular Horatio Gates with Nathanael Greene, who was chosen by George Washington. Greene took command of a still struggling army, but saw its potential. He split his troops and sent Colonel Daniel Morgan west to confront the British. Cornwallis, confused by this, sent Banastre Tarleton to chase Morgan. In January 1781, Morgan tricked the British at Cowpens by pretending to retreat, only to regroup and crush Tarleton's forces. When Cornwallis heard about the loss, he tried to catch Morgan, but ended up chasing him in vain. By February, Greene's main force had reached Virginia, leaving Cornwallis frustrated. Greene's army remained intact and ready to fight. Even though the British controlled parts of the South, American resistance stayed strong. Marion, joined by guerrilla fighters like Andrew Pickens and Thomas Sumter, continued their attacks in the Carolinas. Cornwallis, low on supplies after his failed pursuit of Greene, camped in Hillsborough, North Carolina, hoping Loyalists would provide help. But American cavalry officer Henry Lee cut off these supplies, leaving Cornwallis isolated and surrounded by his enemies. Greene, boosted by reinforcements from Virginia, began moving south again. He had 4,000 men, but most of them were untested militia. For many of these men, time in their enlistment contract was running out, so Greene needed to act fast. He decided to set up a defensive position near Guilford Courthouse, hoping Cornwallis would attack. On March 15th, Lee's cavalry lured the British into Greene's army. Greene asked the militia for just 3 volleys before they could retreat, and they did just that. But events did not unfold as smoothly as Greene had hoped. The chaotic fighting developed into fierce hand-to-hand combat, and the British line started to waver. Eventually, the fighting slowed down, and Greene ordered a retreat as night fell. Cornwallis had won the battle, but at great cost. He lost 500 men, and, worse yet, Greene's army was still intact. Greene's focus was now on South Carolina. He sent messages to Francis Marion and other guerrilla leaders to begin preparing for the next phase of the campaign. Cornwallis controlled South Carolina through a network of forts and supply lines, with Charleston at its base. Greene's plan was to cut off these supplies using quick attacks by his troops and his guerrilla allies. Greene first targeted Camden and the British officer Francis Rawdon. Greene's men held their ground at Hobkirk's Hill, outside of Camden, for a time before having to retreat as his cavalry were hammered by distance and the number of prisoners of war they dragged along with them. Meanwhile, Marion and Lee had better luck, taking Fort Watson and stopping the flow of British supplies. Rawdon then left Camden, burning his supplies as he moved south. Greene and his allies kept pressuring the British. Marion and Lee captured more forts, and Greene moved to attack 96, the western terminus of Cornwallis' collapsing network. The siege lasted a while, but Greene had to pull back when Rawdon arrived to help. Even though the British still had control of a few spots near Charleston, their hold on South Carolina was slipping. By the summer of 1781, both armies were tired and paused the fighting. Rawdon left, passing command to Colonel Alexander Stewart. Greene's troops, though worn out, were ready for a final push. In September, Greene heard Stewart's forces were camped at Eutaw Springs. He quickly joined Marion's men for one last battle. At dawn on September 8th, the fighting began. Stewart sent out scouts, but Greene's troops quickly attacked. The battle was fierce, and the British lines started to fall apart. Still, the British held a strong position at a local mansion, fending off several American assaults. In the end, Greene's forces won the field, but the battle did not give either side a clear victory. Regardless, Greene had successfully fended off the British invasion of the South as his enemy was crippled. Cornwallis was forced to retreat north and await for new orders in Virginia. Part 7. The play, sir, is over. In July 1780, a French fleet arrived at Newport, Rhode Island, bringing nearly 5,000 soldiers led by the Comte de Rochambeau. Washington was grateful for the support, but the French troops had to wait for weeks before taking action. While waiting, they settled in Rhode Island, mingled with the community, and built relationships with the locals. Meanwhile, in early 1781, Benedict Arnold, now a British general, led devastating raids in Virginia with little resistance. Governor Thomas Jefferson struggled to defend the state. Washington noticed Arnold's vulnerable position and sent the French general Marquis de Lafayette south with a small force to try and trap him. By May 1781, Lafayette's army grew, but he avoided larger battles with Cornwallis. Cornwallis was unconcerned, as he could rely on the Royal Navy to escape if needed. However, in July, orders from New York forced him to send 3,000 men to General Clinton, which would give Lafayette a slight advantage. Before he did send the troops, Cornwallis tried to use this time to trick Lafayette into a battle by faking a river crossing. On July 6, American forces attacked what they thought was a British rearguard at Green Spring Plantation. The British opened fire, but Cornwallis held back, waiting for more American troops. Suspicious, Lafayette only sent part of his forces. Cornwallis then launched a full attack, but the battle ended with both sides withdrawing. Cornwallis then moved his troops to Portsmouth, planning to send the requested 3,000 men to New York. However, new and conflicting orders from Clinton caused confusion. At first, their destination changed to Philadelphia, then back to New York, until finally Cornwallis was told to stay put in Yorktown, located on a nearby peninsula. At the same time, the French forces in Rhode Island were ordered to join Washington's troops. In August, news came that the French fleet, led by Admiral de Grasse, had left the West Indies with reinforcements. Instead of attacking New York, Washington and his allies decided to head south to trap Cornwallis. By September, 16,000 French and American troops reached Chesapeake Bay, where de Grasse's fleet blocked Cornwallis from the sea. The French fleet arrived just in time to fend off a British relief fleet, a vital victory that secured control of the waters and completely trapped Cornwallis. Washington and Rochambeau quickly began planning their siege of Yorktown, where Cornwallis had fortified his troops. Rochambeau sent reinforcements to Gloucester Point, across from Yorktown, while the American and French forces built siege lines and moved closer to British defenses by the day. By October 3rd, a fierce battle cut off a possible British escape route. On October 14th, American and French troops attacked key British redoubts. The next day, Cornwallis wrote to Clinton, "The enemy carried 2 advanced redoubts by storm. My situation now becomes very critical. We dare not show a gun to the old batteries, and I expect that the new ones will open tomorrow morning. The safety of the place is, therefore, so precarious that I cannot recommend that the fleet and army should run great risk in endeavoring to save us." On October 17th, a relentless cannon bombardment silenced Cornwallis' guns. Cornwallis then requested negotiations, and Washington agreed. On October 19th, the British laid down their guns, ending a long, hard-fought campaign. Upon hearing the news, the British Prime Minister, Lord North, exclaimed with a mix of horror and relief, "Oh God, it is all over! Oh God, it is all over!" Lord North had been Prime Minister since the beginning of the American Revolution, and resigned on March 20th, 1782. He was replaced by the Marquess of Rockingham. Rockingham, who supported the American cause, immediately worked to end the war. After his unexpected death in July, the Earl of Shelburne took over and also accepted American independence. On November 25th, 1783, the last British troops left New York City. British, French, and American negotiators had been working for months in the French capital, and on November 30th, the Treaty of Paris was signed, officially recognizing the United States as an independent nation. "The play, sir," Lafayette told a friend, "is over." After the U.S. won their independence, there were many ideas about what that independence should look like. Most agreed that the states needed to be united somehow, so the Articles of Confederation were created in 1777 and approved in 1781. The primary question concerning the Articles was how strong that union should be. A union that was too strict could harm states' freedoms, but one too loose might lead to a weak, divided country, at risk of falling under European influence once again. The Articles of Confederation held the United States together for a while, but its flaws were obvious. The government could not collect taxes, control trade between states, or enforce laws. This caused financial trouble and made it hard to deal with problems like Shays' Rebellion in 1786. In 1787, representatives from 12 states met in Philadelphia to fix the Articles, but they ended up writing a whole new constitution. At the convention, two groups stood out, the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. The Federalists wanted a strong central government to maintain order, maintain the economy, and protect the country. They thought the Constitution should have checks and balances to stop any branch of government from becoming too powerful. The Anti-Federalists, however, were worried that this new government would abuse individual rights, just like Britain had. They wanted a Bill of Rights added to protect citizens. In the end, the Federalists won. The Constitution was approved in 1788, but to get support to ratify the Constitution, they agreed to add a Bill of Rights, which gave people basic freedoms like free speech and religion that Americans still value today. The Revolution also affected the economy and society. Even before the war ended, settlers were moving west of the Appalachian Mountains. After the Treaty of Paris in 1783, Britain gave up all the land east of the Mississippi to the United States, and more settlers flooded in. Soldiers were paid with land, and people could buy small plots cheaply, making land ownership more common. This was possible partly because many Loyalists left the US after the war to other British colonies in North America. Some went to Canada, especially to areas near Lake Erie, where many new towns were established. By 1791, up to 25,000 Loyalists had settled in what is now Ontario, and many more moved to Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. The Revolution also had a big impact in France. By 1783, France was drowning in an unsustainable 4 billion livres of debt, mainly because of the war in America and earlier conflicts such as the 7 Years' War. This economic strain, mixed with revolutionary ideas brought back by French soldiers and even Benjamin Franklin during his visits, fueled unrest in France. People saw it as hypocritical that the French monarchy, which restricted freedom of the press and religion, helped a country fight for these very rights. Perhaps the revolution should come to France too. As for the young American nation, its future was full of possibilities, but not without its problems. As more people owned land, they gained the right to vote, especially white men. But many were still left out. Although the US claimed that all men are created equal, over a third of the population were enslaved African Americans. Women and those without property also could not vote. These issues, especially the issue of slavery, would be hotly debated in the coming decades, so hot that it threatened to rip the country in two.